go. Welcome everybody to our Parental Alienation webinar. Today is February 3rd, 2023, and I'm very excited to have two guests. I know you can only see me and one other face right now, but there will be another face joining us in just a minute. We have Ashish Joshi, and we also will have in a minute Siri Gottlieb. So let me just start off by introducing Ashish. Now, Ashish, a lot of you already know him. He and I did a webinar together. Actually, it was November 2020, so it's been over 2 years, and I know there's a lot that's been going on, and we have a lot to talk about with parental alienation. Ashish has basically made it his, your video is not showing Ashish, somebody said? Okay, Ashish has basically been focusing his career on parental alienation. So that is really become his specialty, and just as one indicator of the number of cases he's working on, the work that he's done in this area. He's written a book for the ABA. If you don't own the book yet, I highly recommend that you buy it. I have my own copy. I should have brought it in here so I could show everybody, but it is called Litigating Parental Alienation, and it is an ABA product. So with that, I wanted to then mention something else, a little surprise. Ashish has been working on another book, so that's really exciting, and it's still has a lot of work to do, it sounds like, but just stay tuned. Maybe we'll hear more about it next year. It's Litigating Family Violence, and so that is going to be a really great book. So I just finished introducing Ashish, and Siri is connecting right now. I don't know if she can even hear us yet, so I'm going to wait till she can hear us before I introduce her. There we are. You can unmute yourself, Siri.
Can you hear me?
Yes. So I'm sorry you had trouble getting in. Well, I just introduced Ashish, and now I was going to introduce you, and then we'll take it away. Okay.
All right.
So
wonderful.
I think no problem. Just like Ashish, I think most everybody here already knows Siri. She's very active with the family law section, and she has a very unique background because not only is she an attorney, but she's also a trained social worker, and this means she has done a lot of work almost on both sides of the coin. So she focuses her practice on divorce-related mental health issues, and she's done custody evaluations. And for our purposes today, she's also done parental alienation evaluations, and we're going to talk about that. And I know she's done a lot of other things too, but I was just trying to hone in the resume just a little bit. So welcome to both Ashish and Siri. And just to remind everybody, you can put questions in the Q&A in the chat. And as soon as I stop talking, I'll do my best to try to monitor those. So the way we're going to start, so if you didn't see the webinar back in November 2020, it was Ashish and I, and I would say it was excellent. Ashish, as always, really provides a lot of informative content. And today what we have for you is going to be, I think, substantially different than that webinar from 2 years ago. So you might, if you're interested in the topic and you didn't see it 2 years ago, you might want to go back and watch it too. But we're going to start today a little bit differently. Siri is going to talk to us about the spectrum of the cases of different types of behaviors, from mild to severe. So we can kind of just have an understanding of where these cases are coming from, what the allegations are looking like. And then we'll jump in from there into a deeper discussion of parental alienation. So Siri, thank you. Take it away.
Okay. So just for context, there are sort of two facets of this analysis of alienation that we need to look at. One is the behavior of the alienating parent. What kind of behaviors does that parent do and exhibit that can help you analyze whether what's going on is actually alienation? And the other is the behavior of the child. What does the child say and do? And we're going to be fleshing that out a little bit. But I wanted to just establish that at the outset, that these are two parameters that can be very helpful to attorneys when a case comes in your door and the dad says the mom is alienating the kid. You can ask these specific questions and behaviors, and I'm going to go through that in just a moment. But these behaviors and the child's relationship fall along a spectrum from a natural affinity, like for an infant to its main caretaker. That's completely innocuous. That's normal developmentally. The next level, as the child gets older, the child may develop an alignment with one parent over the other. It usually starts out that, you know, a little girl will be more aligned with her mom. Then as she gets a little older, she might become a daddy's girl. And then she's at that point more aligned with dad, but then it shifts back. Nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly normal developmentally. The next level that we get concerned about is estrangement. And Ashish will talk more, I think, in detail about how he views the issue of estrangement from the legal perspective. But this is basically a child rejecting a parent for some pretty good, objective, legitimate, reasonable reasons. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Lots of times the parent is just, you know, being a jerk, and I'll go into a little bit more detail after I run through the entire spectrum. Beyond estrangement, now we start getting into, is it alienation? Is this child rejecting a parent for no real good reason, but as a result of behaviors of the alienating parent to try to make an alliance with the child that marginalizes or excludes the what we call the targeted parent or the rejected parent, where the kid actually does start rejecting that other parent. Extreme forms of alienation are basically child abuse. And this was a radical notion when it was first proposed some years ago. But I have to tell you that as far as Western countries go, the US lags far behind in terms of enlightenment as to how alienation is child abuse. For example, I just read a study out of the UK where they talked about the law in France. I have not verified this independently, but the law in France saying that if you try to interfere with your child's relationship with the other parent, you can be prosecuted. And if you are found to have tried to or succeeded in alienating your child, you will not have custody of that child. Brazil, likewise, it's a crime and it can be prosecuted. So the tricky part, and Ashish can talk about this from a litigation point of view, is where along this spectrum of innocuous to abuse does this particular family fall in the relationship between the child and the alienating parent and the relationship with the targeted or rejected parent. You want me to stop for any questions at this point?
Yeah, I think this is probably a good point to jump into a little bit of a deeper dive. But before we do that, I kind of took things a little bit out of order. I wanted to see if both of you, just for like 1 minute each or 2 minutes, could just talk for a minute about your role in cases involving alienation. And then after Ashish and then Siri, you do that, we'll take a deeper dive into some of these issues that you're kind of laying out for us on the spectrum. Siri.
Okay, I wonder if it would make sense for Ashish to talk about from the legal standpoint, how a lawyer with an alienating a case of potential alienation might make use of a mental health professional.
We'll definitely want to address that today. Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, should we start with that? Or I can just say that, you know, I conduct alienation evaluations, which are similar to custody evaluations, but more targeted, strictly focused on the question of whether there's alienation or not. I do custody evaluations, and looking for alienation is always a part of that. But an alienation evaluation is a different animal. It is really focused on analyzing what are the dynamics within the family and does this constitute alienation.
Ashish.
Also, yeah, I was just going to add that a GAL can be helpful too, but a mental health GAL is probably your best bet because they understand the psychological dynamics in a deeper way.
All right, Ashish.
Thank you, Liisa. Good to see you, Siri.
Hi, Ashish.
Hi. So I agree with Siri about the use of mental health professionals in these cases. And in my opinion, the earlier you get a mental health professional involved, the better off you, the attorney, are or will be. Michigan happens to be one of those jurisdictions where you don't require a lawyer or an attorney to be a guardian ad litem. A GAL could be a psychologist or a social worker, for example. And in cases involving significant alienation dynamics, child abuse, mental health issues, it is far more productive and helpful to have a psychologist or a social scientist or mental health professional function as a GAL than an attorney. Lawyers, of course, have their own strengths, but the danger of a traditional lawyer filling the shoes of a GAL in alienation cases is that the alienated child often ends up becoming over-empowered. And as we say, children should have a voice in these matters, but not a choice. And what you often see in alienation cases is the dynamic becoming worse and worse because the children end up becoming over-empowered. Other than the GAL, a mental health professional could also help look at the dynamics and figure out if it is indeed the case of alienation. And if so, to what degree? Because in my experience, it's not always a binary solution. It's not always either estrangement or alienation. Sometimes there are shades of both dynamics involved. Sometimes there are other issues, such as a child having some sort of disability or being on the spectrum or having oppositional defiance disorder because of various issues in the dynamic. And it's always helpful to have a mental health professional help the attorney interpret the medical records, the therapy records, sometimes not miss the forest for the trees, so to speak.
So one of the questions, and we do have several questions. I'm going to try to fit them in as appropriate. So if we haven't answered your question or presented it yet, just be patient. We're going to get to it. But relevant to that topic, Ashish, one of the questions was if we have any recommendations for doctors to do an alienation evaluation. So we already mentioned that Siri actually does parental alienation evaluations. Do you know like what other types of professionals that you could recommend that are capable of doing a parental alienation evaluation?
I usually, well, I wouldn't say usually, because it all depends upon the jurisdiction, where the case is, and what are the available resources. You know, before COVID, we used to look for the geographical proximity. So a Kent County case would have Kent County professionals, and Washington would have Ann Arbor or Washington area. And since COVID, one of the things that has come out of it is the availability of professionals from different areas and not so geographical proximity is no longer the main consideration. So I have looked for social workers, PhD psychologists, sometimes MDs as well, depending on the case. But it's important to understand that if the evaluation is focused on the alienation dynamics, you are not looking for someone who does standard custody evaluations or parenting time evaluations. You are looking for a clinician or an expert who has the experience, knowledge, and skill in these family dynamics to do an evaluation.
Yeah, can I piggyback on that?
Yeah.
Real quick. I wouldn't get too hung up on the credentials, the letters after a mental health professional's name. What's key is, have they been trained in a serious, comprehensive way to assess for alienation? And this requires, you know, attending conferences, taking courses, reading, keeping up on all the research. Ashish will probably mention at some point most recent research, which is very valuable. You know, we all know that therapists who don't understand the particular dynamics of alienation frequently make things worse. They will say something like, well, you know, just give her time, she'll come around, she just needs to, you know, keep staying in therapy with me, and she'll approach the parent she's rejecting now when she's ready. And that is the exact opposite of what should be happening. So a therapist who says that doesn't know the first thing about alienation, which can become very quickly entrenched, and then it's very unlikely that the relationship can be repaired. So these kind of cases really call for immediate early intervention.
Right. So we have a lot to tackle here. I'm trying to decide if any of the questions that we've gotten so far we should save for a minute. I wanted to see if we could talk, we started talking about alienation, but before we get, and I think that the spectrum that you went over, Siri, is really helpful. I wanted to see if we could just spend a little bit of time talking about estrangement and what that looks like, so that we can kind of contrast it with the various degrees of alienation. And Ashish, I mean, I have a case that I think is a pretty decent example of it, but I wanted to see if you wanted to address that topic, and then Siri as well.
Sure. So broadly speaking, alienation dynamics focus on the child's refusal or resistance to a parent for non-legitimate or unjustifiable reasons, sometimes frivolous or even absurd reasons. And the evidence shows that the child's rejection is a product or byproduct of influence, coaching, or alienating behaviors. On the other hand, estrangement cases involves either abuse by the rejected parent, significantly deficient parenting behaviors, or neglect. So there is a justifiable reason because of which the child is rejecting that parent. So for example, you could have a child rejecting a parent or resisting contact because the rejected parent has been found to be abusive by repetitive protective services investigations. You have one CPS report after other showing that the parent has engaged in abusive behavior. Or you could have a parent who is an alcoholic, and there are significant concerns of alcoholic and related behaviors, presence of domestic violence, where the children have not only been victims of domestic violence at home, but have also seen that abusive parent engage in abusive behavior with the other parent. So it happened in front of their eyes. And so these cases are known as estrangement cases. But again, it's not always the either or situation. When you usually get a case involving alienation, there are more often than not, allegations made about abuse, allegations made about how the parent who is being rejected is at fault because of deficient parenting or his own issues, her issues, whatever. And the model that is used typically by experts to rule in or rule out alienation does have a factor which focuses on absence of abusive or neglectful behaviors on the part of the rejected parent. So it's very much part of the equation.
Could I add, just for nuts and bolts around this, that I think what Ashish is saying is the difference between estrangement and alienation is, alienation is a campaign by one parent to interfere with a relationship for no good reason other than their own vindictiveness or mental health problems. Estrangement happens when a kid rejects a parent for some good reasons. And those might be, as Ashish noted, that the parent being rejected has been abusive to the child, or the child has witnessed abuse of the other parent, but it's frequently just a bunch of bad behavior. The parent disrespects the child. Now we're talking adolescence at this point. Is disrespectful, a lot of boundary violations. For example, barges in on the kid when she's in the bathroom. Overly controlling, doesn't have a clue about how to deal with an adolescent. This frequently happens between dads and adolescent daughters. Neglect in the sense of just not being there, not showing interest in the kid, not going to games, not ever going to the doctor with the kid, not attending teacher conferences, not showing up for school programs. That child is going to feel that their parent is not interested in them, doesn't really care. and then says, why should I go spend time with him when he has no interest in me? That's estrangement. And that parent who's engaging in that kind of behavior, hopefully they're workable enough that with some coaching from a mental health professional, they can change their behavior. And some family therapy can go a long way toward helping reestablish a respectful and loving relationship between a kid and a parent whom she's rejecting because he's a jerk.
I wanted to share before we just to leave estrangement behind for a minute. Before we did that, I wanted to share just an example from one of the cases that my office worked on. Another attorney in my office worked on. It was called the Schindorf case, and our client was being held in contempt, and thankfully had not been sent to jail yet because the judge did not feel that the reunification with the father was happening quickly enough. I think it was an estrangement case because the children had not only witnessed their mother being very violently assaulted by their father, he also abused them, for which he was convicted on both counts. And so they had their own reasons, even though mother was bringing them to therapy as she was told to do, and in her view, doing everything she was supposed to be doing. The children just were not ready, did not want to participate yet. And that doesn't mean they won't ever be ready to participate. It just means that it was just too soon for them. But the judge was going to, throw our client in jail because the children weren't ready yet, basically. Anyway, but alienation, like you said, it's unjustified, but the children have an unjustified dislike of one parent. Not because of all these other behaviors that we've been talking about. We're getting a lot of questions, and I'm actually more than normal. So it's really exciting that so many people are so engaged today. I think we have some nuts and bolts questions. A lot of people, and I don't think we're going to be able to answer them all here today live, but a lot of people are actually wanting resources to how to find this parental alienation expert if they need one in their community. We've had a lot of people from Southeast Michigan that have asked that question. But one question I wanted to make sure we had a chance to ask, is it unusual if the expert who's a social worker interviews one parent and the child, forms an opinion about alienation based on those interviews without ever having talked to the other parent? And I know what my instincts are. I hope that's unusual, but I wanted to see if you two had comments about that kind of situation.
That would be malpractice. Not to
Of social worker malpractice. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And this happens all the time. Social workers, they don't get how critical it is to interview both parents before rendering an opinion. I do ethics reviews for the state. This is a primary complaint that people make against therapists.
So if you're the other parent, the one who wasn't interviewed, is the appropriate response then to file Ashish, do you have any ideas? What do they file in the trial court to kind of flag this problem that you can't make a decision based on an opinion when they haven't ever interviewed me, the targeted parent, for example?
Okay, so there are a lot of issues there. So let's unpack that. I think it's problematic for any professional to interview just one parent and then jump to a conclusion of alienation or estrangement. I think if the interviews are going to be conducted, it has to be a proper interview of the entire family, the children, the parents, collaterals, everyone. And that's what happens in a standard forensic evaluation, where everyone is interviewed, the relevant people. However, there's a different procedure, which is called forensic record review, in which a professional, could be a social worker, could be a MD or psychologist, doesn't interview anyone. But there's a plethora of documentation available in terms of CPS reports, police reports, therapy notes, medical records, deposition transcripts, case pleadings, which would provide reliable, factual, and clinical information to that expert to do a forensic record review and then opine upon what's going on in this family. And that is routinely done in many jurisdictions, including Michigan. But even in that situation, it would be inappropriate for that professional to interview just one party and do the rest by document review. So if you are going to just rely on documents, then you have to be just focusing on the objective information that could be gleaned from the record review and not speak with anyone. So that's the difference between the two. I often see this issue come up, especially with guardian ad litems as well. And it's not unusual for a GAL to file a report, not interviewing all the collaterals or taking the testimony or statements from the child without any corroboration. I'll give you an example. Typically, you see a report come down from the GAL or sometimes the child's therapist that it would be the traumatic, quote unquote, traumatic for the child to go on visitation or see a parent. And there should be a temporary suspension of the parenting time. And there's an ex parte motion filed. And depending on what's being alleged, sometimes the parenting time is suspended. And then the trial judge starts talking about, well, we'll have a hearing. We'll get to a hearing, but let's in the meantime protect the child. And that causes tremendous harm in a case involving alienation, because the more time that the child spends without meeting or having any contact with the targeted parent, the more entrenched alienation gets in. So if there are allegations of abuse, it is critical that the trier of fact, the judge in the case, makes a finding, takes a judicial finding, evidentiary hearing, whatever it takes. But we see, and Liisa, you know this, cases that will go on appeal, often having parenting time suspended without any hearing whatsoever.
Right.
And that's
And then it takes 18 months to get the decision from the
Exactly.
trial court, and then there's appeals. And so in the meantime, I think it was in Judge Gleischer's dissent in the O'Brien versus D'Annunzio case, where, what is the message that is being sent to that child who already had maybe conflicts with the targeted parent? Maybe there was already, teenage daughter having problems with her mother. The message being sent to the child, as long as it's an old enough child, I guess, is that there's something terribly wrong with this parent, and kind of justifying why I'm not having a relationship with this parent.
Right. And you also see another factor, unfortunately, is the triangulation of professionals, particularly therapists.
Can you
where
can you explain what that means, the triangulation of
The
professionals?
triangulation basically refers to the alienating parent and the child and the allies of the alienating parent. Triangulate a profession, could be a GL, could be a child's therapist, could be a school teacher, a counselor, into furthering the agenda of alienation. So, for example, let's assume that the father is the alienating parent and the mother is a targeted parent. You see the therapist seeing the child repeatedly when the father brings the child. So if there are 15 therapy sessions, 15 out of 15 or an overwhelming number of sessions happen when the father brought the child. The child comes in, badmouths the mother, denigrates the mother, talks about horrific abuse, whatever happened to the mother's home. The therapist does not have any contact with the mother. The therapist does not try to see what goes in the mother's home, whether a child's reporting is accurate. And the therapist starts believing this distorted perception that the child has of the rejected parent. And what comes a day when the father says, the child is absolutely traumatized, couldn't sleep at night, having nightmares. She has a visitation coming up over the weekend. I don't know what to do. Could you please write a letter how difficult it is for this child to go and see the mother? And the therapist writes a letter. It's attached to an ex parte motion, goes before the judge, and we have a temporary suspension of parenting time. And that causes a huge issue, in not only just in litigation, but also from a mental health perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Because now the child is with the father. There's an independent adult and authority figure who has also determined, without any investigation, that the rejected parent is abusive.
So like I said, there's a lot of questions, and here's one I think it's related. I think this might be a good one for Siri to help us answer. One of our participants asked, what is the best approach to convince a professional to keep an open mind and even be willing to listen to the idea of parental alienation, or not, I guess, depending on which side is hiring the expert, right? Like trying to get them to have an open mind about the possibility that there is or is not alienation happening in the case.
A professional in which role is Can you be more specific?
Well, I think the question was hiring, we're having a social worker on the case. Maybe not one that, no, not somebody who's been brought on to do a parental alienation evaluation, but somebody who's already involved in the case in a professional capacity. How do we like have them like a therapist? How do we have them open-minded about what's going on?
Right. Once a therapist, because what Ashish is talking about in terms of triangulation, we might also refer to as a therapist aligning with one parent against the other. And there are parents who do exert a campaign on the therapist to draw them in and seduce them. And once that therapist has decided that, you know, the targeted or rejected parent is a bad guy, it's really difficult to get that therapist to backtrack on that for a lot of reasons. Number one, therapists are human. They don't like to be shown up to have made a mistake. They want to save face. They can become very wedded to their own ideas. They're aligned with the child, and they feel very strongly that their job is to advocate for the child, protect the child, and they're barking up the wrong tree. But you can't undo that. I mean, I wish I could say, oh, all you have to do is X, Y, Z. Sometimes, I mean, I will recommend as a GAL or a parenting coordinator, get a new therapist involved. You know, no therapist is indispensable, and a child can form a therapeutic alliance with another therapist as well. But once a therapist becomes an ally to the alienating parent, it's very difficult to backtrack on that and get them to, quote, see the light. It takes a special person to say, wow, I didn't know that. I wasn't aware of that. I'm really not up to speed on, you know, what alienation really is. And thank you for pointing that out to me. And I need to get myself educated. You know, it's not the normal human response.
So another question that was posed earlier is, you know, once if there is a finding of parental alienation by, you know, some expert, obviously the findings can be made by a judge, but when there's an opinion that comes out that says, hey, I think there's alienation happening, what is the solution? What is the solution? How do we fix it?
Well, go on, Siri. You were about to say something.
Well, no, I was going to say, well, let's see. Ashish could talk about it from this point of view, and I could talk about it from the other. Depending on the severity or the intensity of the alienation, there are different ways to approach this. If it's mild, some plain old family therapy can go a long way. If it's really entrenched and on the abusive end of the spectrum, there are programs, and Ashish, you can talk about them if you want to, intensive 4 or 5 day programs where the child and the targeted parent go and work intensively with a therapist who's trained in the program. It's basically sort of reprogramming the kid. They've been brainwashed. You're showing them how they can experience the targeted parent in a new way, a loving way, absent the influence of the alienating parent. And once that intensive 4 or 5 day program is completed, the judge enters a no contact order between the child and the alienating parent for 90 days more if needed, because you've got to get the child out of that environment for the gains to be maintained. You can't send that child back to the alienating parent after a 5 day deprogramming and expect that the child is going to be able to resist that parent's nefarious, you know, insidious bashing of the other parent. We could talk for an hour about different treatment modalities.
Ashish?
I agree with that. First of all, alienation is a spectrum, as Siri explained. So the remedy or the relief for a mild case of alienation could simply be psychoeducational therapy counseling for the parents and involve the children depending on the ages of the child. It's important to order makeup parenting time if a parent has been losing out because of violation of court orders or the child refusing to go and see the parent. But I think the underlying issue in most cases is there is often a lack of consequences for bad behavior. You see many cases where one parent has been repeatedly violating court orders, repeatedly violating orders to take the child to therapy, repeatedly violating court orders for make-up parenting time, vacations, not sharing information with the other parent despite joint custody. And if those behaviors go unaddressed and there are no consequences, nothing is going to matter. The
Right.
court orders are not worth the paper they're printed on if there are no enforcement mechanisms. So you
Exactly.
need to enforce the court orders. In a severe case of alienation, what you have is child psychological abuse. The children have a very toxic, distorted, delusional perception of the rejected parent. And it takes time to correct that. So the first thing to understand is to take the child physically out of the toxic, alienating environment. You don't give antibiotics to a patient and then put the patient back into the germ-infested environment. It doesn't work. You have to have a protective separation where you remove the child from the alienating parent for a temporary basis and then have a specialized reunification counseling with aftercare. And it does several things. One, it breaks the loyalty bind that the child has with the alienating parent. Number two, it allows the child to develop resiliency and critical thinking skills that are very much necessary in this situation. But most of all, it allows the child to experience the rejected parent in their authority parental figure. Because in alienation situations, the rejected parents are completely undermined as parents. They are disempowered and the child is overempowered. So you need to reset that equation where the child is demoted to the level of being a child and the parent is being promoted to the level of being the parent. And that resets the whole equation.
Excellent point, Ashish. One of our participants who is a former referee made a comment earlier about how he had seen as in his role as a referee overly, I'm going to quote, overly empowered children, and how that presented a huge barrier to reunification. So it's kind of like just resetting the boundaries, I guess, would you call it? I have a question for the audience, but there's another thing I wanted to make sure we got to. So I think I'm going to go back to what I wanted to originally make sure we had a chance to cover, because this is going to be really important and helpful, I think. We were going to talk about there's been some studies that talk about, I think there's 12 behaviors that can be used as markers to evaluate whether there may or may not be alienation. And I didn't know if either one of you were maybe able to talk about what those 12 behaviors are that people can look for. And maybe it's not just one of those that, oh, well, there's just one, so definitely we have alienation, but just kind of give us markers that help attorneys evaluate, hey, if there's enough of these, is this a case where maybe we should get some help, either because I represent a targeted parent and I'm concerned that they're gonna come after us, or the other side, I'm representing the parent who is targeting, the parent who's trying to keep the child away from the other parent, and we think we need to establish parental alienation, whichever the case may be. Would one of you or both of you be able to address some of those behavioral signs that we can consider?
Just to clarify, you're talking about behaviors of the child?
I thought when we were talking about it, yeah, maybe you and I talked about it the other day, Siri, and now that you asked that question, yes, I think so. You're right.
Right. Well, we can both, Ashish and I can both contribute to this, but I started out by saying, there are two facets we have to look at in analyzing whether there's alienation. And one is the behavior of the alienating parent. What behaviors are they exhibiting that point to, yeah, there could be alienation here. And the other is the list of behaviors you see on the part of an alienated child. And, it should be said that a parent can engage in alienating behaviors, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the child becomes alienated. So you want to look at how is the kid behaving as well. Before we go into any of those, the checklists, Ashish, did you want to add anything at that point?
No, I mean, you're right. I agree. I mean, there are typically known as 8 manifestations of alienated child, and then 17 behaviors which have been found to be alienating behaviors on the part of the alienating parent. So that's a part of the 5-factor model analysis.
Okay.
The other important thing to note is that while in most cases we have a parent who is typically found to be alienating, if it's a case of alienation, it's not necessary that it always has to be a parent. There are plenty of cases where an older sibling, for example, has been alienating, and it's alienation by proxy. You find sometimes a grandparent or even a close family member take the lead role of the alienating person, and the other parent is simply docile and allows it to happen. But the behaviors that you're looking for in terms of the child are a campaign of denigration that the child maintains against the rejected parent. The reasons given by the child for rejecting the parent or resisting contact are either weak, frivolous, or sometimes even absurd. You find the child demonstrates lack of ambivalence. There is absolutely no ambivalence in rejecting the parent, no guilt associated whatever as well. Sometimes you find the independent thinker phenomenon present, where the child tells the judge or the GL or the therapist unprompted, no one told me to say these things, I came up this on my own. And some of the statements in the cases involving severe alienation are so fascinating from a cognitive developmental view of the child that you see a 7-year-old making statements that clearly are not a product of the child's experience with the other parent. You see the reflexive support that the child has regarding the favored parent, black and white or polarized view. So the rejected parent has done nothing right in his or her life, and the favored parent has done nothing wrong. So my mom's perfect, my dad's horrible. Well, did you have any good times with your dad? See, we have all these vacation pictures and videos. Your dad was your soccer coach during your elementary school years or whatnot. Nope, I was faking it. I wasn't happy. He was never present. You just see the child with an absolute black and white view, which is not what you see in normal, healthy relationships, where there is often ambivalence involved. So these are some of the signs, but Liisa, it's important to note that you don't need all of that. You don't need every checkbox to be checked, for a case to be of alienation. You might have a 3 or 4 signs shown by the child, and still it could be a case involving moderate to severe alienation. And then on the other hand, you have the behaviors of the favored parent, like carrying on a campaign of denigration, interference with other parents' parenting time, asking the child to spy, aligning the child with them, sharing inappropriate information, showing court papers, keeping the other parent outside of the loop of medical, academic information, withdrawal of love when the child comes back from the other parent. These are well-documented behaviors. And what is interesting is that the research shows that these behaviors are pretty much same regardless of the culture or geography or where the people are from. So you find the same behaviors that are considered to be alienating behaviors in, let's say, Italy or Germany, in studies done there, and compare them to the US or UK, there's a remarkable consistency amongst these behaviors.
So if we wanted to learn more about the 5 markers and the alienating behaviors and the behaviors of the child, what resource should we go look to learn more about these?
Well, in terms of professional literature or books, is that what you're asking?
Yeah. As an attorney, like if I'm working on a case and I want to help, well, if I were a trial attorney, if I wanted to help identify whether my client is engaging in alienating
Mhm.
behaviors, or whether my client's the victim of the other parent engaging in alienating behaviors, for example. All these things that we're talking about, where can we go for as a resource? Is that in your
So
book?
as just a, oh, I'm sure it is in Ashish's book. I was just going to say that for quick and dirty, when you've got the client in your office and you're trying to figure out,
Yeah.
is this really alienation? We can certainly supply the checklist of the 17 behaviors that alienating parents frequently engage in, and the 8 presentations of a child that indicate that the child has been alienated. I mean, you can send that out in a mass email, if for starters.
Got it.
I mean, going back a few years, Lisa, I wrote an article for Michigan Family Law Journal, a 2-part article on parental alienation, the problem, and parental alienation remedies. And I believe I discussed these signs and behaviors in that article. So that's one. Second, there's a great book that came out in 2020 called Parental Alienation, Science and Law. And that has several chapters by experts and professionals world over. And there's a specific chapter on how to diagnose a case, or how to engage in fact finding using the 5-factor model, which has this information. I wrote a chapter in that book surveying the entire world in how does the different systems around the world, common law systems versus the civil law systems, and how they approach alienation. For example, it's considered to be a crime in Mexico and Brazil. In some countries, they are a lot more advanced in how they view alienation and how quickly that they intervene in a situation involving alienation evidence. Because in any case of alienation, time is of the essence. And especially, what is counterintuitive is that judges often think, well, the child's 16, going on 17, so let's pump the brakes. We can't really force a child to do anything that they don't want to do. And what they should be doing is just the opposite, because there's so little window left for proper treatment before the child emancipates, that they should absolutely go towards the opposite spectrum and provide the intervention that is needed as fast as possible. Because the research shows that with proper intervention, the situation is absolutely reversible.
So you mentioned what other countries are doing, and what the research is showing about why it's so important to intervene quickly. I think I heard the other day from Siri that there's some new research and studies coming out, and that's, if I'm characterizing it correctly, some important research that's coming out. Ashish, is that something you can just really quickly tell us about?
Sure. So in terms of cutting edge research, I would suggest or recommend to the lawyers and professionals to look up 3 papers that have come to us in the past 1 or 2 years.
Okay.
All of them are peer reviewed. All of them have been published in reputed scientific journals. So the number one is titled Scholarly Rumors, Citation Analysis of Vast Misinformation Regarding Parental Alienation Theory. And this is published by Dr. Burnett and Dr. Zhu. And they talk about repeated pattern of misinformation and disinformation that prevails in family courts about parental alienation. And it's a shocking study of the same level of misinformation that just goes around and keeps on repeating itself and misguides the judges and courts and professionals. That was published in 2022 in the journal Behavioral Sciences and the Law. The other paper that came out was also in 2022, and the title is Developmental Psychology and the Scientific Status of Parental Alienation. And it's published by Dr. Jennifer Harman and Richard Warshak, Dr. Lorandos, and Dr. Florian, 4 authors. And this paper shows that majority of what we know regarding empirical science and observations of alienating behaviors in science has only come to us since 2016. So if you are looking at old criticism of the parental alienation syndrome or old criticism of Richard Gardner, who died 2 decades ago, or old criticism about how parental alienation doesn't have scientific underpinning, you are way behind the times, because the cutting edge research has been coming out to us year after year with research, empirical observations, and peer reviewed. So it's important to read this paper to see what the current level of scientific underpinning is on alienation theory. And last but not the least, a wonderful article by Dr. Burnett and Dr. Greenhill. Dr. Greenhill, by the way, is a contributor to DSM-5. So it's important to know about this author. Their article on the 5-factor model for diagnosis of parental alienation and the scientific validity of that model was published in 2021 in the Journal of American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. And this is a great paper. It's a short paper, and it basically informs a judge or a forensic evaluator or an attorney as to how can you make a finding, a clinical or a judicial, of presence of the alienation dynamic in any case. How do you evaluate the evidence? What do you look for? How do you rule in or rule out the alienation dynamic?
Thank you. That is, and everybody wants to cite, so I'll be following up with everybody after today, probably sometime next week, so we can give some more of these details on paper for everybody. It's just to me, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, just because we're almost out of time. And I just wanted to mention one thing that I think might be helpful to attorneys in dealing with their clients who are claiming alienation. Can I take 30 seconds right now?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, please do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I think we have lots of important questions we could still try to get to. I just wanted to let the lawyers know that, these clients who come in claiming alienation, they don't always look so good. They're angry, they're anxious, they're upset, they're agitated, they're very emotional. They're desperate people. They have lost their children, or they feel their children slipping away from them. And it can be off-putting to professionals who are trying to help them, but also to the courts. And it's really important to get your client some coaching or some therapy or whatever you want to call it, to help prepare them for going through the legal process, and to help them manage their emotions so that they don't undermine their own case, because they frequently don't make great witnesses.
Siri, that is such an excellent point. I mean, a lot of regardless of who are representing, moms or dads, I mean, it's a very stressful time, and sometimes people are not, they say that in family law cases, you see really good people at their worst behavior versus criminal cases, you see bad people at their best behavior. Well, I mean, we see people are at the utmost stress, and they sometimes some people just don't manage it very well. And that comes across to the judge.
That is absolutely true. And Siri made a great point. And I want to just follow up on that by saying there's a difference between reaction to alienation and causation. Sometimes people confuse reactionary behavior to something that caused the estrangement or alienation in the first place.
Right.
You take away someone's child when you are being rejected by your flesh and blood, when you are facing repeated violations of court order by the other parent with absolutely zero consequences. Anyone is going to be frustrated. They're going to be angry. To just see that behavior and then to speculate that, oh, this is the reason why the person must be getting rejected in the first place. I mean, that is a standard fallacy that you see in these cases.
Wonderful. I think both of you wanted to address, and so we can take 2 more minutes or even 3, the concept of the reunification counselors, even once they've, if they're court-appointed people that have been brought in to treat the family, that they are, the question about whether they're supposed to stay neutral or not. I think I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I know both of you had some thoughts on that. If you wanted to share what your thoughts were as kind of our final closing question.
Sure.
Maybe I can start just very briefly from the mental health perspective, because a lot of the work that we're asked to do, we're charged with being neutral. But the fact is, I come into every case neutral, unbiased to the best of my ability, but you are going to see and hear things, and you are going to start to formulate hypotheses and see them play out, and you will be.
She froze. Okay, so since she froze.
I
if it
mean, you
takes
have
her a
to
second,
call it like you see it. What was that?
You froze for a second, so you have to
Oh,
call it like
I'm
you see
sorry.
it. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm just saying that I think that's barking up the wrong tree by banging a drum about mental health professionals have to be neutral. Yes, we come in with an open mind and we gather information and we test our hypotheses and we listen to what people say and we watch how they behave, and we will formulate an opinion that maybe, I mean, this is way reductive, but sometimes one person is the bad guy and we have to call it like we see it. That doesn't mean we're not neutral. We don't do the courts or people any service if we try to tippy-toe around bad behavior. Got to call it like it is.
Ashish?
Yes, reunification counselor, after a finding of alienation is made, has a very different role from a traditional therapist. Traditional therapists are trained to validate the client or the patient's emotions, feelings, sometimes behaviors. They build a rapport, they build trust. In a situation involving reunification, the counselor has a different agenda, which is to reunify the alienated child with the rejected parent. And that sometimes requires confrontation in a clinical sense with gentle persuasion as well, but nonetheless challenging the child's distorted image or feelings or perceptions about the rejected parent. It involves disempowering an over-empowered child. It involves empowering the disempowered parent, coaching the parent on how to manage a tough situation at home when you have a alienated child who has been coached or influenced to have police or the CPS on speed dial. So it requires some handholding, requires some coaching. The reunification counselor is not required to sit on the fence and just call the shots and just stay quote unquote neutral. I mean, that would be disastrous. So to argue that the therapist is somehow aligned with the rejected parent just reflects a lack of understanding of the role of reunification.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Siri and
That-
Ashish,
One last thing, Liisa, it is critical that when you have a court-ordered reunification, the reunification counselor should be given any and all evidence regarding alienation. Because if they are not told upfront that this is a case involving alienation, you risk a complete getting different treatment. Because reunification that is based on the trauma abuse model is dramatically different from reunification that is focused on alienation dynamic.
Siri and Ashish, this has been so fascinating. There's so much to cover. We probably could have had a 3-hour session, and I know we didn't get to all the questions, and I apologize for everybody out in the audience who has been asking questions. I'll try to go over the list of questions early next week, and to the extent that we're able to maybe provide a couple other answers in the materials that we send with the takeaways, which will next week include a recording. It will include hopefully some citations to articles if folks want to go read some articles. It will definitely include a link to go look at Ashish's book and maybe buy it if you're so inclined. But this has been extremely, extremely helpful and fascinating. I really appreciate both of you for coming on today.
Thank you,
Our
Liisa.
pleasure. And by the way, anybody who has any questions for me, feel free to just contact me directly. I'd be happy to chat with anybody anytime, pick my brain, be happy to talk with you.
All right. Well, thank you all. Have a good weekend and look to
Thank
hearing
you.
something from us next week.
Bye.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
very much. Bye-bye.